Good morning and good afternoon. Last week we talked about some of the words in the first line of the Bodhisattva vow, and one word that we didn't discuss was the word vow, which Mavanwi noted, and so I thought I would speak a little bit about vow today. And also, just in case I don't remember at the end, next week Mavanwi will give a way-seeking mind talk, which is a talk about what brought her to practice. And a few weeks later after that, Alex will give a similar talk. And that's the tradition when someone has taken the set of the Bodhisattva vows. It's traditional for them to give a talk about what brought them to practice. And it's a way to inspire us in our own practice, and also kind of just a way to get to know each other, because we often spend time just sitting in Zazen. We don't get to know each other that much in a certain kind of like in a narrative way. We often don't know much about each other's narratives. So that will be happening next week. So thinking about vow, we could ask ourselves, what is our most sort of fundamental aspiration? You know, if we're here, coming to Zen practice or listening to talks, there's some aspiration, there's some drive, intention in our doing that. So what is our deepest aspiration? And each of us has to work that out for ourselves. Often people will have an initial aspiration, which is to not be so restless. That might be their initial aspiration. Or it could be an aspiration to be a better person. You know, if one has a tendency towards anger or self-doubt, one might come to practice to see if that can change. But I think maybe the deepest aspiration we can have is to wake up to the nature of reality. That, I think, maybe is the deepest aspiration. Because waking up to the nature of reality, all the other aspirations one could possibly have kind of get resolved, not completely, utterly, instantly resolved, but all, in a way, you could say, fall into that basket. That basket of awakening contains all the other possible aspirations one could have. Because when we awaken to the nature of reality, compassion naturally follows. It just naturally follows. A sense of belonging naturally follows. Caring and feeling intimate with everything and being curious about what's arising in front of our eyes just naturally follows. So in many ways, I would encourage all of us to make that our primary aspiration. Everything else follows from that primary aspiration, to wake up to the nature of reality, which we cannot understand. And that waking up, not only does it make us more compassionate, feel more connected, and all of these things, it is energizing. It gives us energy, because we're not functioning in resistance to reality, we're functioning in accord with reality. It gives us a lot more energy, which makes us of more benefit to the world in whatever we do with our lives. So then the question is, how? How do we wake up? Waking up is not something that's conditioned. We can't make it happen, but we can have the aspiration to wake up. and then we can create conditions. And in our tradition, as in many other traditions, it is zazen, daily meditation, and contemplation, and upholding the basic precepts that we have of being a non-harming person in the world. So regular meditation, regular study and contemplation, and doing our best not to do harm, and where we can do good, they create conducive conditions. And although here at Twining Vines we're not in a situation yet where we can offer retreats, sesshin, I think maybe soon we'll do a half-day zazen kai, a half-day sit, and from there we'll move to a full-day sit, but it's going to be a while before we can offer retreats. But I would encourage anybody who can to create the circumstance that you could go and do a retreat, do a sesshin, because it creates very conducive conditions for waking up. And waking up isn't necessarily a one-off event. People vary. Sometimes they have a very profound experience in retreat. Any experiences I've had have been in retreat. So I do think that is really worth trying to find a way to carve out in our busy lives, to carve out 3 days, 5 days or 7 days to do a retreat. It's not essential, but it does create very conducive conditions. And then while in retreat, of course, it's not a matter of simply being there, it's keeping on bringing the mind sharply back now, bring it back to now, bring it back to now, over and over and over. And if not retreats, we can do our own version of solitary retreats. And I'd like to share with you an experience I had maybe 7 or 8 years ago, where I was still caring for a fairly young child, so doing sesshin was not easy. I was able to do maybe 1 or 2 a year sometimes, but not as many as I would like. So I decided to just do a one-day retreat by myself, sitting in the zendo. This was in Santa Cruz. And I sat facing the wall, but at a window, and I opened the window a little bit, and I sat there, so not on a schedule. I wasn't doing 40-minute sits or anything like that. I just sat for as long as I could, and then I would get up and walk kinhin, and then sit again. Tried to not pay any attention to time. I think I might have set a timer for the end of 8 hours. I can't really remember how I did that, but I tried to let go of time altogether and just sit for as long as I physically could. But looking out the window, there was a comfrey plant. And I don't know if you're familiar with what a comfrey plant looks like, but they have rather big leaves. They're slightly furry, but they're sort of firm and soft at the same time. So they're physically soft, but quite firm and quite large, dignified leaves, in my opinion. I thought they reminded me of zazen. Like the comfrey leaves reminded me of what we do in zazen. It's a medicinal plant. It's got this beautiful leaf that's sort of soft but firm and dignified, just like us. So I looked at this leaf, and it was quite an extraordinary experience. I really looked at that leaf for 8 hours, and it slowly, extraordinarily slowly, lifted up over a course of a few hours, maybe 1 inch, 2 centimeters, something like that, not very much. But it did lift. It was initially touching the dirt, and then it rose over a number of hours. And my mind softened in such a way that I was really able to be very engaged with this leaf. And I really watched it slowly move. I felt like I was in communion with the leaf and could feel it moving. And as well as that leaf, little other things would happen, like an insect would come in and sit on the leaf and then fly away. or a bird would land and scrabble in the dirt for a minute or two and then fly away. So there are these little accents, little quite fast things happening. But this leaf just slowly lifted, and then shade came across, and then it slowly dropped down. I still remember that leaf. You know, it's years later, I still remember that leaf. In fact, Sarah, if you walk up the pathway at the side of Zendo, it's probably still there, the little comfrey plant, and you can see it. So we can do things like that to create conducive conditions for waking up. And just while I was sitting here, and I don't know if this will work, I'm going to try sharing a metaphor for what waking up might be like. When we wake up, then we have to care for it. We have to care for the waking up. It's not like the end of the story. It's the beginning of a very new story. But it does make remembering the teachings much easier, because we have a felt bodily experience of non-division, of non-duality. We feel it, we've felt it. It's a metaphysical experience. It's not a cognition, it's not an emotion, it's not a bodily experience. It encompasses and transcends all of those. And then it makes the teachings easier. So I was thinking it's a little like if you were meeting someone, let's say a train station, and you knew them well, like say your mother, it wouldn't be hard to recognize them. When they stepped off the train, you just go, there she is, there's my mother. You would just like, boom, there's my mother. You wouldn't have to go like, is that my mother? It's just like, boom, that's her. So when we have experienced one or more sort of awakening experiences, we can engage with others with that sense of without effort. We automatically feel empathy. We automatically feel compassion. We automatically feel connected. We don't have to talk ourselves into it. So then, just using this metaphor a little bit, if we'd had some kind of awakening experience, but then we didn't look after it, we kind of thought like, that's it, I'm done, fantastic, I'm awake, nothing to do now. It'd be a little bit more like you met a friend and it was wonderful, but you haven't seen them for 10 years. So then you're going to meet them at the train station. You'd have to try a little harder. You'd have to like, is that them? I think that could be them. Yes, that is them. But it would require more effort. It wouldn't come with spontaneity. It would require sort of, you'd have to, the cogs in the brain would have to be turning. And so that's why it's so important whenever we do have an insight that we need to care for it and polish it and look after it like a jewel. We need to look after it. Otherwise it'll be like a friend you haven't seen for 10 years. It'll be more like that. And then continuing, if there was someone you were going to meet at a train station that you'd never met before, but you had a written description of them, they're tall, they'll probably be wearing dark clothes, they'll have a blue suitcase, something, they'll wear glasses. If that's all you had, it would be much, much harder to recognize them in a crowd, getting off a train. And when we come to practice, we're like that when we first come to practice. That's why first coming to practice is usually hard, because we haven't met fully face to face yet the true nature of things. We've just got these guidelines, the cognitions. They're ideas, but that is all we've got, and so that's okay. We work with that, just like if we were picking someone up, like you sort of see in the movies, or maybe if you go to airports, you see someone holding a sign. They're looking for someone, and they're trying to connect, and they're just using theory to connect. They're using information that they have with each other. So it is like that when we come to practice, and that's okay. It's just how it is. But what we want for ourselves is to recognize things the way we would recognize our mother, who we'd just seen like 3 minutes ago, and we're seeing her again. Boom, total recognition. There's no doubt. And this is why awakening is often spoken about so highly, because it does make the capacity to fulfill our vows much easier. We don't have to think through things. We naturally feel that connection. So the vow that we talked about last week, we're vowing to liberate all beings. We're vowing to abandon delusions, to enter all Dharma gates, and to become Buddhas. That's the Bodhisattva vow. And we can see how difficult that would be if it was just an abstraction. So this is why we do Zazen, to slow our minds down and create these conducive conditions to have an experience that is beyond the normal sensory experience. And it's also why I think we recognize people who have had that experience. We recognize it in them. We don't know how we recognize it, but we do recognize it because it has a quality. It's an effortless quality to it. So I just looked up, in the dictionary about the word vow, and some other words for vow is a solemn promise, a pledge, a personal commitment, and an earnest declaration. And we can do that publicly, and we can do it privately. And if we do it publicly, we then also keep on doing it privately, over and over and over, many times a day. We remind ourselves of our vow to liberate all beings, to not do harm, to become a Buddha, to dissolve our delusions, to enter all Dharma gates. We can repeat that vow to ourselves, not formally, just as a felt sense of like, oh yeah, my vow. And we vow to do our best and notice when we falter, but not to be mean to ourselves when we falter. When we falter, it's all about just being curious that we faltered. That's all. That's it. Oh, I spoke ill of someone, let's say. It's a very common falter, a little common misstep, is to speak ill of someone. We just have to notice, oh, I did that. Or I elevated myself by saying something about someone else, not exactly criticizing, but the way I spoke kind of elevated myself. We just have to notice that. Notice it, but I do think it's good to be unflinching with ourselves. Set a high bar for ourselves, not a cruel bar, not a mean-spirited, judgmental, harsh bar, but an unflinching, kind bar. That's how I think of it for myself. I want to set the bar high. I want to be unflinching with my errors, but kind as well. I'd like to read an abbreviated version of a koan called the True Chien, which is in The Gateless Barrier, and the translation by Robert Aitken. I think it's case 36, maybe, the True Chien. I would recommend, if you have it, to read the more detailed version of this story. I'm going to read a brief version from Catherine Thanis, who has passed away. Catherine Thanis Diosho. She was the abbot of Santa Cruz Zen Centre for many, many years, and this book is The Truth of This Life. And the reason I want to read this story is part of this aspiration to wake up is to close the gap between ourselves and others. So this is a story about a gap. It's an old Chinese story. The story is of a beautiful little girl named Qian, who is dear to her father's heart, especially since her older sister had died. As a child, Qian played so nicely with her boy cousin that her father said, "You two should marry when you are older." The cousins took this to indicate that they were betrothed, and as they grew older, they fell in love. When it came time for her to marry, however, her father, having long since forgotten his earlier comment, selected another young man for her. Qian and the young man she loved, Chao, were desolate. He couldn't bear to be near her anymore, so he soon boarded a boat and left. As he was going upriver, he heard footsteps on the bank running alongside the boat, and to his delight turned to see Qian coming after him. Happily, they went off together to a neighbouring province, married and eventually raised 2 children. After 5 or 6 years, she began to long for her family and village. When she mentioned this to Chao, he confessed that he also missed his family and friends. They decided to go back. He would apologize to her father and explain what happened. They returned to the village, and while she stayed on the boat, he went ahead to meet her father. When Chao met him and apologized, explaining what happened, the father was extremely surprised. He said, "But Qian is inside. She has been asleep ever since you left. She is in her room. We haven't been able to stir her." It was now Chao's turn to be completely surprised. "But she is on the boat," he said. "Come, I'll show you." So they went together, and as they approached, Qian stepped off the boat to meet them. At the same moment, the one who was asleep arose from her bed, went towards the approaching young woman, and the two merged into one. So that's the story. And then here's Catherine's comment here. It asks, which is the true Qian? There's the koan about this, and the question in the koan is, which is the true, or who is the true Qian? In one version, Qian herself is quoted as saying, "I myself don't know which is the true one, the one who stayed behind or the one who went off with Chao and got married." And Catherine says here, "I understand this story to express the sense some of us have of being deeply split, as if at some juncture of our lives we weren't able to completely integrate the conditions of our life and we became divided. Reflecting on the story, I asked myself, where or what was the turning point? What turned separation into unification? At some point she, Qian, remembered her past, her parents and her village." And so I think this is a beautiful story, and one that we can contemplate over and over and over. There's great depth to this story, and many, many people have written commentaries on this story. And one part in the story I think that's pivotal is the moment that Qian and her husband realize that they miss their family. They miss, in this story, their biological family. But we could think of this family as our true family. You know, we're living our lives, we're doing things, have a job, raising children, and then we realize that we're missing something. There's a family that we miss. You could say our true self, the true, untainted self. We miss that self. We miss the Dharma. We miss the truth. We're not quite seeing the truth of things. We might be living good lives, but there's something, we can feel a restlessness. And then they return. And I thought about In my own life at the moment, as some of you know, I'm caring for 3 grandchildren for 40 hours a week. It's a lot of time. Don't be caring for them. As Alex and Mavan, we know, I sometimes like, yeah. But I could be split about that. I could be split. I could be thinking, I just want to do Zen practice now. I just want to be attending to the Zendo and reading the Dharma and so on and so forth. And instead I'm stuck with these 3 children, making sandwiches, blah, 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 doing all of that. I could be quite split about it. But what is much better to be is to say, this is a choice I'm making. This is a reality I have, and I'm choosing it. Either we sometimes choose things for a bigger reason that we choose them, such as in this case, or we don't have a choice. You know, it's just how it is. You know, maybe if we have an illness, we can't will the illness away, it's how it is. Or if you have your own children, it's not very realistic to just give them away. Mostly we say, this is how it is, I do have them. In this instance, I'm choosing these grandchildren to care for them. I don't have to, but I'm choosing to. And so what is better is to not be split. And the way to not be split is to fully be with the moment that we're in. And for me, it's a great opportunity to notice I'm feeling resistance rising in me. I'm feeling a constriction arising in me. How do I breathe with that? How do I open to that and be compassionate to that and proceed skillfully? And sometimes it's many times a day I need to notice a resistance. And then how do I open to, this is a reality. This is my life. I want to be grateful for my life. So we can be doing one thing and we can be returning home at the same time. We don't have to be either pining, like Chien was pining in the room, where she just wasn't functioning in the marketplace, in the world. Or we can manage both worlds at the same time, the world of form and emptiness, if you like, you could say it that way. We can be with the reality over and over and over without resistance. This is what's arising, let's be with it. That's closing the gap. But as I said, it's much easier to do that if our aspiration is to wake up and we make that our sort of, that's like the arrow at the bullseye that we're aiming for. We want to aiming for a waking up. And even after waking up experience, there's always more waking up to do. It's not like there's no end to the process of waking up. You see teachers who have been teaching for 20 years, 30 years, still deeply engaged with the teachings, still deeply committed to their zazen, wanting to deepen and deepen on more and more subtle levels. Here's an example, like here's my notes, and here's a 2-year-old scribbling all on my paper. This is my reality. He scribbled all over my notes that I've written out, and I had to rewrite them all. Look, Nana! So that's that moment, to not be split in that moment. Here's my notes written for the Zen talk, and the 2-year-old scribbled all over them. How not to be split. How to go like, it's a 2-year-old. Of course, he's scribbling all over my notes. And something a few weeks back we were trying to remember, there was 2 sayings. I can't remember which one we spoke of here, but they both came into my head. One is, if you're off by an inch, you're off by 1,000 miles. And the other one is, a hair's breadth deviation is the distance between heaven and earth, which I think is the one that we mentioned in a talk here some weeks back. A hair's breadth deviation is the distance between heaven and earth. So a hair is not very thick. And again, this is a saying to think of kindly, not punitively. But if we get angry or resist reality just even in a little way, just once, in that moment we are fully immersed in delusion. Or if we have compassion for all beings except a few particular people, that's like the hair's breadth. It might be only one person out of 7 billion that we can't have an open heart toward, but still, that's the hair's breadth. That's the 1 inch is 1,000 miles off. So that's the exacting part of our practice. We want to keep the gap closed in every circumstance, in every situation. And simply notice when we don't, because of course we will falter. And just simply notice when we don't. So I think I might stop there and see if anyone would like to comment or ask a question.